Welcome to this week's virtual reading group at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. My name is Samantha Hill. I'm the assistant director. We are reading Hannah Arendt's second work, Rahel Varnhagen, The Life of a Jewish Woman. And this week we're going to be talking about the second chapter, Into the World, 1795 to 1799. It was fun to read this chapter. I think I mentioned last week I hadn't read this book in a little while, and going back through, I'm continuously struck by the tone that Hannah Arendt is writing this kind of pseudo-biographical work in. It's what I've started in my notes calling the young Arendt. And I think in this chapter, which is divided into two sections by marriage, and I think the second one is through love, we see in a kind of funny way the distinction between the private world, the private realm, and the public realm of recognition that becomes really central in a lot of Arendt's later writing. So this chapter is a kind of romantic portrait of Rahel Varnhagen, not romantic in the sense of romantic poetry, which apparently she was turning away from in a certain sense, but romantic in the sense that we're getting an image of her love life and the kind of neuroses Arendt ascribes to her on-again, off-again relationship with Karl von Finkenstein. So it kind of chronicles their meeting and their engagement, which lasted for, I think it was about 5 years, and the dissolution of their relationship. And Arendt throughout is trying to dig into the kind of psychology behind Rahel's role in this relationship, and what's motivating Rahel to, kind of, I want to lust after, long after, fall in love with, pursue this man and what he represents for her in the landscape of her life. Rahel thought that marriage was a means by which she might escape her Jewish identity and might assimilate into society. And ultimately, marriage, as it turns out, wasn't quite for her. And Arendt paints it as this kind of tragic tale of wanton romance, where Rahel kind of had a sense of what she wanted, but she wasn't actually able or willing to make the sacrifices that were necessary in order to have a relationship with a man like Count von Finkenstein. And I mean, as I was reading this, and I'll keep kind of recounting Arendt's account of the relationship, but I kept wanting to actually go and dig up the diaries and the letters and to see this, she's taking, there's so many quotations threaded throughout this chapter, and she's taking these little snippets from Rahel's correspondence and the letters and drafts, and she's weaving together this kind of psychological portrait of her love life and this relationship. And I think it would be interesting to go and see the letters and how we would read them as individuals. And she's going to end the chapter, of course, by saying that he got rid of all of her letters, but she kept hers until the death. And I'm not sure if I can wholly agree with Arendt's characterization of Rahel as this kind of woman who is unwilling in certain ways to pursue the relationship that she thought she wanted. There's a lot going on in here in a certain sense, but I wanted to kind of just to start the conversation, since it is this love story, to maybe draw it into context of some of Arendt's other writings. On page 36 and 37, I'm working in this volume Um, she is talking about marvets and individuals, and she's talking about in Finkenstein's relationship to his family. And he was born into a world and into a family where everything was predetermined for him. He had a sense of what his life was going to be from the beginning, and this was the exact opposite of Rahel, who was completely free in the world. And it's actually in Arendt's Denktage book, there's a beautiful page in her thinking journal after Heinrich Blücher dies. There aren't entries for a while, and then she just simply writes ohne Heinrich, without Heinrich, and then later writes, I'm as free as a leaf in the wind. It's hard not to wonder if Arendt's engaging in a bit of projection when she's writing about Rahel and thinking about her own romantic affairs. But it's on page 36 and 37, on the bottom of 36. She writes, when Marvitz spoke of the bourgeoisie, he meant the tradesmen and the artisans, the rising mercantile entrepreneurs who fought for freedom of trade and for the right to acquire landed property, who were ultimately carrying out the revolutionization of the country, were to him only objects of hatred and contempt. This type of bourgeois was only what he had, quoting Wilhelm Meister, and therefore cared only for his own life and his chances of success. He belonged to no estate in the old sense. He represented nothing. All he had to show was what he had. If he made any attempt to seem, he at once became ridiculous and absurd. In being unable to represent anything, he was not a public person, but a private individual. If by some chance he nevertheless entered the public eye or public life, there remained alongside this public self an essentially private self with a specific occupation which had nothing to do with himself as a public person. And this language is really striking, having read Arendt's work on the human condition and the origins of totalitarianism, both thinking about the way in which she describes the political emancipation of the petty bourgeoisie, why private individuals decide to get involved in the realm of politics, why they decide to appear in public for recognition in front of others in order to pursue political and economic agendas. But we see in the middle of this story this kind of characterization of a dual life, one where there is a self that is essentially private, that is divorced from the public self, which is the self that appears in the world. And on the next couple of pages, she uses the word appearance quite a bit. And she talks about how the salons became these kind of realms in private that facilitated appearance before others, which is interesting because in this early work of Arendt's, in this young Arendt, we have one of the first examples of a space of appearance is not the public realm of political recognition, but it's the salon, which is a kind of social space held in private where we represent ourselves through conversation with one another. And I don't think this is a contradiction to her later writing on the realm of appearances, but I think it kind of fills it out in an interesting way. Some people have picked up on the emphasis Arendt places on friendship and her private relationships and her correspondence with Mary McCarthy. But I think it's interesting to think about the salon as a meeting place where we learn how to represent ourselves through word and deed, right? They become these kind of spaces where we get to appear and try out arguments and expose ourselves to conversation and to others, and it gives one a sense of meaning and place in the world. She says the salons were the meeting places of those who had learned how to represent themselves through conversation. The actor can always be the seeming of himself. The bourgeois as an individual had learned to show himself, right? Not something beyond himself, but nothing but himself. And that language of learning to appear as oneself, as nothing but oneself, to go naked, echoes Arendt as well in the famous Shar passage, which she's referencing as, being able to go free, to go naked, to appear before one another as who we are without the kind of imposed mask that is often imposed upon us when we appear in public, but that we can actually be seen when we appear before one another. And this, just to add one other note that struck me when she was talking about love, she gives the example of Dorothea Schlegel, who was the daughter of Moses Mendelssohn and who married the famous poet Friedrich Schlegel. And she holds up Dorothea Schlegel as this kind of, character parallel to Rahel Varnhagen. And I'm on page 32 and 33. And on the bottom of page 32, she says, Dorothea Schlegel encountered life just once, when she met Schlegel and he loved her. But she had once abandoned life again by immortalizing this moment. There was nothing in her life to narrate, because it had no story, because it stubbornly took its stand upon the experience of a single swiftly passing moment. She simply threw her life away upon a moment. And it's such a striking passage. In two senses, for me at least, in reading this. One, it reminds, it's hard not to think, well, is this where Arendt started thinking about love as something which is profoundly apolitical, the way she writes about it in The Human Condition, that love turns us away from the world and in upon ourselves into this private realm which can only be held between two people, that love is world-denying intimate love. And that if you give your life to love, right? And part of what Arendt's, if you're struck and you give yourself to this is not life in her account and her understanding. And she says that there's no story, there's nothing to narrate, right? When Arendt's talking about how we appear before one another, we appear before one another as unique individuals in word and deed, and we express ourselves and we're heard, and everybody has a right to be heard and remembered, and poets and artists record our words and deeds, which allow them to continue living in memoriam forever past our own existence, that we can tell life, that we can narrate our experiences. She's always repeating anything can be born if it's put in a story. But for Arendt, love is not an experience, right? At least not in the way that she understands Dorothea Schlegel's relationship. And she sees Rahel Varnhagen being kind of caught in this web with this man who she wants, but who she's also at the same time convinced he doesn't love her, right? And it's, I think, thinking about our last conversation and reading this chapter today, it's in many ways, this feels like a surprisingly timely book to be reading in a certain sense, because Arendt doesn't often talk about herself as an individual in her writing. And she's an incredibly private person in certain senses, which is not surprising. Elizabeth Young-Bruhl, in her biography, writes about how shy Arendt is and how she gets very anxious at having to even go to a party to talk to new people. But that once she appears, she kind of has the energy of an actress, and she has a lot of gravitas about her. But here in this early work, we have, in many senses, Arendt's thoughts on women, on a woman, and on love. Two incredibly personal and private topics that she really doesn't she doesn't talk about in her political and philosophical work, topics which she relegates to a different realm of life. And there's, I think, a lot to be said about the way that Arendt as a writer is approaching Rahel as a woman and judging her life and her decisions and trying to think about her as this essential actor at this moment in time in the world. Okay, I'm going to stop talking and see if we have any questions or if there are thoughts. Roger, I know you're on if you want to add anything.
Well, Daphne, when we start maybe with Daphne asks the question, Sam, I don't know if you have a take on it of why she was interested in Rahel Varnhagen in the first place. Um, uh, I know that she and Anne Weil, to whom the book is dedicated, um, uh, both read Varnhagen's letters together. And I think as a young Jewish woman in Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s. I mean, clearly the quote that she begins the book and ends the book with, this quote about how on her deathbed, Rahel Varnhagen says that what seemed to me the greatest shame, which was the misery and misfortune of my life, having been born a Jewess, this I should on no account now wish to have missed. I think this quote is what Arendt is struggling with. I mean, as a brilliantly talented young thinker in Germany in the late 1920s, early 1930s, being a Jewess is certainly a misfortune in some objective sense. And yet she's struggling with what it means. And I think by revisiting, and we have to admit, she's not just a private person and a Jew. Arendt has very particular ideas that she's developing now about what it means to assimilate, and her critique of assimilation, which we began to talk about last week or last session, and we're going to talk more about as we go through this book. And so I think she finds in Rahel's failed assimilation, or in the way Rahel Varnhagen really sought to assimilate, and in the end came to see the tragedy of assimilation, I think is what most what Arendt most responds to, and the sort of impetus for the book. Although I think she also thinks it's worth telling the story of this remarkable Jewish woman.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the kind of, it's in the historical context, and she's working on this she's in exile in Paris as well. And, you know, one of the questions that becomes incredibly important to the origins of totalitarianism and the work on pariahs and parvenus and refugees, which she does in the late 40s, is what she sees happening to Jewish identity and the kind of threat assimilation is posing to Jewish identity, and how assimilation, and she writes about this in Origins, in part laid the groundwork for totalitarianism to take hold in Germany. And one of the phrases that kept, so this chapter doesn't really, I think this chapter is, about her love life, but her love life in relationship to her desire for assimilation and what this man represented to Rahel Varnhagen. One of the phrases that kept striking me that Arendt uses a few times is that she failed to become a specific person. She uses the phrase specific person. to differentiate herself from the mass through assimilation by entering into aristocratic and bourgeois society. That one could be come culture, that one could distinguish themselves by losing their mass identity. She, on towards the end on page 49, she said, when fate did not accept her sacrifice, when she became aware that she could not succeed in converting her lover into a specific person, she's talking about him here, into after having first deprived him of his support, that she wanted to make him something, you know.
I think it's
Are
worth
there
taking.
other thoughts or impressions? Roger, do you want to?
Yeah, I think it's worth taking a look at that whole paragraph that Sam is reading.
Yeah.
What page? It's on your page,
It's on page 49 in my
and
volume.
30 and 38 in the other edition. I mean, let's just read it and see. I mean, so it starts in the paragraph before it, even the one that starts, "May eternal justice
Yeah.
grant me that I tell the truth as audibly and strongly as I feel it in my soul." And Arendt really makes a lot of the fact that Rahel here is going to portray herself as a trumpet of eternal justice and the mouthpiece of justice, to tell the truth. And then this paragraph that Sam was reading, um, uh, well, is her telling the truth. If one merely accepts fate, if one does not act at all, one attains security which enables one to offer the same passive resistance to all misfortune. When Rahel tries to act, she would find she had no starting point from which she could meaningfully begin, could not do anything specifically individual.
Yeah.
But since Frankenstein's love had made her a specific person without a specific world and without specific patterns, outlined only by love, since she had entered upon the adventure of particularity without having been taken in by any particular society, the sole stake she could offer for any action was her own self. I mean, this is a. What does it mean to say that her Finkenstein's love had made her a specific person without a specific world? Well, he wanted to marry her, and she was coming out of she was a Jewess who therefore was not in the world, and was excluded from the world. And she has this incredibly interesting, Arendt does, analysis of Finkenstein, which is that he had a family and he had a society, but only in the provinces. And that when he came to Berlin, he was nothing. And in fact, Rahel was more important than he was, even though he was a count. And that his love, in one sense, made her a specific person. It took her out of being a Jew, which was to be a nullity in German society. But because he was a nullity too, he actually couldn't bring her into the world. And all they had was this, and this is, I think, the interesting comments on love that Sam was, I think, getting at, although we'll see. All they had was love. And the sole stake she could offer was herself, but they didn't actually have a world. And it was sort of this abstract, worldless love, without much meaning. And, I don't think that's the kind of love Arendt found in any of her loves, whether it's Heidegger or whether it was Guter Stern or Guter Anders, or whether it was Heinrich Blücher. I mean, I think in all of those cases, Arendt found a certain world. Maybe I'm wrong. We could analyze it. I mean, but I think what she's saying is that Rahel, as a Jewish woman in love with this count who didn't have a world in Berlin, in a sense, the love was worldless and purely without any particular worldliness to it. What one makes of that, I'm not entirely sure, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that, you know, that characterization of Rahel's relationship with Finkelstein strikes me in some ways as more plausible than the way Arendt is recounting it. And on Arendt is she never says, I think, quite directly that, she says Rahel wanted to love him into loving her. And she says it twice, she never believed that he loved her. And that he, had suffered the misfortune of falling in love with her, but that it wasn't the kind of love that Rahel wanted. And I think what Arendt is kind of dances around but never quite says is that what she wanted from Finkelstein, he couldn't give her. And because he couldn't give her what she wanted, which was entrance into aristocratic society, and then she couldn't believe that he actually loved her. And it seemed to me as I was reading this chapter that Arendt was, in a certain sense, kind of blaming Rahel for enduring this 4-year relationship. Or however she says on 45, but what then is reality? Did she seriously want the break? Those 4 years of loving and being loved, of suffering and uncertainty, were they not also reality? To be sure, Finkelstein bent every effort to people to present with illusory images and to make any definite decisions impossible. Thus, breaking with him would at least continue an assurance that life would not stand still, that something would be happening. It was as though the break were the only reality still possible. But later, in her old age, the break would have entered so completely into the story of her love that she would have difficulty differentiating it from different types of reality. And she paints her as this kind of, woman who doesn't actually know what she wants in a certain way vis-a-vis this relationship. I think Arendt is a tough critic of love. I'm not, I don't really read it as, I think, Roger, I agree that her relationships were never, they were quite different, in many respects. Heidegger was a passionate love, a romantic affair. Her first husband swept her off her feet through, philosophical wordplay. And Heinrich Blücher, she wrote to Jaspers, gave her a sense of history. He was her interlocutor, the person that she, engaged in conversation with. And I think her loves were different, but it's very clear that Arendt never put love at the center of her life. She was not a woman who wanted to, it wasn't about getting married and making a home and a family. She had other things. She sees love as this thing that exists in this romantic, consuming sense that pushes one away from the world. And this is kind of ironic because the one thing Rahel wants more than anything is entry into the world. And somehow she thinks she can get there through love. And I think for Arendt, she sees them as incompatible. They don't play nicely together in that sense.
Sam?
Hi,
Um,
Daphna.
Hi. In the first page of this chapter, the paragraph is all about how she was thinking about the advantages of having him love her, and
Yes.
of her becoming a countess, and of
Yes.
her leaving behind her Jewishness, and of her escaping all these shackles. It's very disparaging, of love. So I don't know what Hannah Arendt is trying to say, that women who toss themselves into relationships for the purpose of erasing themselves, or erasing their identity, is
Yeah.
that really going to achieve love, or anything at all? But she's also rather disparaging of Rahel throughout by saying she was never exceptional, she was never
Yeah.
particularly this or particularly that, which is why I raised the initial question. I don't see that Hannah Arendt is saying about, say, other Dorothea Schlegel, that um, that may have been love. She wasn't as disparaging as she is about Rachel, which is why I raised the question. I'm not sure what she's trying to say, because if love is what we think it is, it's not what Hannah Arendt is portraying it in this chapter to be. I
I'm
don't
not,
think Rahel was in love with him ever, but yet she wanted love.
she,
Anyway.
yeah, I mean, it's a question in the way Arendt sets up this chapter, whether or not what she actually wanted was love, the love of a man, or what she wanted was what marriage could facilitate for her. And I think from Arendt's rendering, it's more the latter. It's that this marriage represented an opportunity for assimilation and to pull her out of, she says at some point toward the beginning that it was, as when he proposed, well, that's the, where is it? That I think it's in the, Rahel wanted to escape from Judaism. Everything is topsy-turvy. No Jew stays put, but alas, I alone wretchedly stay where I am, she wrote to Brinkman again a few years later, when all her prospects for marriage had been shattered. If she married the Count, the son of the Prussian minister, she would become Countess Finkenstein. He had fallen in love with her, was blonde as a yellow brick, and the first man, I won't read the French out loud, as she wrote to Alexander von der Marwitz 16 years later. She said yes at once, snatched at the chance as though she had been only waiting for such an event, never for any particular reason, as though she longed only to be taken away from what and where she was. Once she became a countess, her disadvantages could be forgotten overnight. Nothing would remain of Jewishness but a natural solidarity with all those who likewise wanted to escape from Judaism. It's never about, I mean, for Dorothea Schlegel, it's about love, right? But for Rahel, it's never about love. It's about what this man represents and her continuous what is the book, not Mrs. Dalloway, not the Virginia Woolf, but there's the novel, the woman living in the country with the man, and she drives them into horrible debt and ends up, like eating cyanide and killing herself at the end of the novel. Somebody knows, but it's about desiring to, she wants to be seen when she appears in the world as an aristocrat. And so, she buys endlessly all of these things, which leads to her own demise. I can't remember the name of the novel right now. It's very obvious. Madame
Sam, what do you?
Bovary. Madame Bovary. But the other quote that I'm reminded of is the from We Refugees, and people who try to escape who they are destined to become these Ulysses-like wanderers, which is a beautiful kind of image Arendt gives us. But I feel like this chapter in some ways is Arendt really hammering on her point that all Rahel wanted was to not be a Jewess. She thought she could get there through marriage, but you can't even get there through marriage. You can't escape who you are. She was unable to achieve assimilation. Roger,
I wanted to just, I want, I think what you're doing in that first page of the chapter about how she simply wanted to escape Judaism, and Rahel longed to depart from Judaism, and what you said with that is exactly right. At the beginning of the second section, right, which is through love,
yeah,
it opens with this incredible scene where he comes to visit her 12 years after their split, and
with his
wife, and simply says, and asked after no one, nor asked how I was. It's as if he, as if nothing has happened. And suddenly he said, I wish very much you would see my wife. You would like her so much. And, Arendt said, and she says if there had been a magic ring, or Rahel says that if there had been a magic ring and turned it back 12 years, and he had, she would have been happy to take him back. And Arendt glosses this in the next paragraph, and she says, so then she had loved him,
yeah,
he who was nothing. She who, as Veit had said, could find no object of love. So I think this is, one of the things that's so interesting about this book is it is a biography of sorts. It's an attempt to understand this woman, and to go back to Daphne's original question, why is Arendt interested in this woman? Who loved someone who was nothing, who could find no object of love. Because she thinks there's something meaningfully Jewish about this, which is not only about wanting to escape Judaism and depart from Judaism and assimilate, but that someone who is Jewish in the way that Rahel is, she could find no object of love. And Finkelstein was not even merely the chance object that made her catch fire. She was in no ways seeking romantic love, which often is more than the object of it. Otherwise, she could have calmly dropped him. But in fact, she had let Finkelstein go after years of fighting for him. In her innocence and inexperience, she saw in him a person who represented nothing specific and unequivocal. Since she herself was attached to something specific, she had no possibility of choice. Excluded from society, she could only allow herself to be drawn when something chanced to encounter her. He was the first man who wanted her to love him. And so I think what she's saying is that for people excluded from society, Jews, Jewesses, they don't really love something specific. What they love are people who recognize them. And that there's a danger in the Jewish life of Berlin in this period, to simply respond to any society, non-Jewish society, that recognize you, and to fall in love with being recognized because you yourself need that in some way. And I think that's to some degree, and what she's saying is that that Varnhagen's love was not romantic love, was not love of anything specific, but was simply a being drawn to.
She
and
says,
I think that's a fascinating approach to her thinking about this particular love that Varnhagen had, and she takes it seriously. I mean, we may poo-poo it, but she says, "Look, this was real. It meant a lot to her."
She says on the next page that what she loved was the very chanciness of him, and that the more he got to know her, the less he loved her. But no knowledge could stop Rahel from pursuing him. It didn't matter who he was as an individual. It was what he represented. Robert?
Yeah, I think this says something about the kind of trauma or pain someone has when they're trying to enter a society that does not recognize them. And that's, I think, the situation of a lot of Jews at this time. How agonizing it is and how desperate it is. She wanted to find an entrance, any entrance. And I'm comparing it to Arendt's description of Disraeli, who also was Jewish and married an aristocrat, and the aristocrats eventually said, you know, you married me for status and money, but you stayed with me for love. So the end result was very different in that case, but it was still the same issue of how does a Jew, and of course Rahel describes herself as a schlemiel. I can't imagine any woman defining herself as a schlemiel. I mean, how low can you go? You know, and she wants to escape being a schlemiel and being Jewish into this society that can recognize her as an aristocrat. I mean, she desperately wants this. I certainly saw this in my family. They were all desperately trying to assimilate, get out of this Jewish thing. Yeah. And also at the end, at the end of her life, she says, you know, that's the one thing that actually was a treasure in her life, being Jewish. So the whole thing is a huge irony.
Yeah.
So this is Susan. I mean, I was also really struck by how, so Hannah Arendt is in 33 was like 27, I think. And she just started this affair with Heidegger, who wasn't Jewish, who had a lot of class and fame and respect. So, you know, I just kept thinking both that, you know, she has this kind of, there was a kind of romantic portrayal of Rahel, like almost melodramatic. So I kept thinking, well, they were both like young women, young Jewish women yearning for something in slightly different times, but with a lot of similarity. And I think, I don't know if it was you earlier who talked about Hannah Arendt's projection. And I think a lot of times, even the writing, like there's a place in the second chapter where she both quotes Rahel, but then continues writing, and you almost aren't sure unless you're really careful whose voice it is. Is it Rahel or is it Hannah Arendt?
Yeah. I mean, so she went to study with Heidegger at Marburg in 23 or 24.
Mm-hmm.
And she finishes this book in 1933 originally. She revises it later, but when she flees Germany after things have ended, I mean, with Heidegger, I think there's another, I think Jenny Lynn also wrote a question along these lines in the chat box about projection. Do you think the critique of Frau Schlegel and Arendt saying it's not a good idea to be with someone like that reflects her experience with Heidegger? Or that the analysis of this breakup with the Count is informed by her perspective as somebody whose marriage to Stern is already falling apart when she's working on the book?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult for me to read this and not think about Arendt's own romantic affairs. I mean, the language choices are very striking and judgmental. And at certain points in reading this chapter, I wondered if somebody could actually get away with writing in this tone today, a biography of this nature. Interesting. But she, you know, Arendt has her, you know, it's funny because as a political, Arendt is, you know, one of the most incredible political philosophers of the 20th century. She was a woman and she was Jewish and she was a refugee and I try in my conversations about Arendt, I think, and in reading Arendt to not dwell on the fact that she's a woman or to feminize her writing in a way that we would never do to certain male authors. Even Heidegger, for example, and others. But this book kind of draws it to the fore, I think, in an interesting way. And Arendt did have an interesting relationships with men throughout her life, beginning with the death of her father when she was, I think it was 7 years old, when he died of syphilis. This was the great traumatic event of her life. She wrote to Heidegger early on in their correspondence what she called her shadows, which is this, 12-page kind of almost free association, reflective journey through the grief and loss of her father, and thinking about herself as an individual now set apart in the world, without this kind of loving relationship to her dad. Not to get overly Freudian, but then she has these incredibly rich romantic relationships of her own, and Heidegger was drawn to her, at least he wrote, because of her brilliance. I don't think Arendt ever I don't think Arendt ever positioned herself for the men in her life in the way that Rahel positioned herself toward Count Finkenstein. And I think there is some projection here, but I think more than that, I think Arendt is being incredibly critical and judgmental of women who prioritize love over all else in their lives. I'm not sure if that's directly answering the question, maybe in a way. Margaret, or yeah?
Yeah. Can I jump in here?
Yes. Who is this?
This is Margaret.
Hi, Margaret.
The thing that kept coming through to me was that, yes, she wanted to escape her background, her Jew. Yes, this guy would do it for her. But what does she do as soon as he's in her life? She tries to change him away from the very thing she thought were what she was seeking out. And I thought that there was a complexity and a profundity to that is very resonant.
Yeah.
Any group that is more, call it on the margins, and wants to be in but doesn't want to be in. And so I saw throughout the description of Rahel in this, her health over, she couldn't go and be Dorothea. She couldn't just jump into it and do what she thought she wanted, because there was still part of her that was still there. And that complexity of identity, I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, I think building off that and what Roger said a little bit ago. So on page 43, so there is this, and I think what Robert was talking about as well, that this is also about a specific quality or trait that Rahel possesses as a Jewish woman at this moment in time. And in many ways, her understanding of herself as an individual in relationship to the world around her is counterposed to the way that Finkenstein sees himself. On 43, she says, but he, when he chanced upon her, fell in love with her. He chanced upon her. He fell in love with her. This is not what happened for Rahel. Rahel was out looking for someone or something that could help her get out of this position. With her in particular, and in so doing made her a specific person. It is hard to say whether he seriously loved her. She, at any rate, did not believe that he did. He wrote to her such stereotyped phrases as, if you had only been able to see how, if you only knew how, which did not seem very convincing. She demanded a binding, definite acknowledgement and took offense when he put her off with hopes of the future. He was accustomed to having his life predetermined for him, and hope was for him only the sweet surrogate for specific planning. He knew in advance what his life in the world was going to be like. He had every assurance that the world would not deny itself to him, that the world would not deny itself to him, that he could trust the world. He had a place in the world. The world would hold him. He could be. He was free. That gave him a sense of freedom. But Rahel was distrustful because there was no place in the world for her, and she considered hope foolish. Hard to say whether he loved her. She repeats herself. He was overwhelmed by the consequences that had resulted from his first stab at love. And she goes on. But Rahel couldn't trust the world. She had no way of relying upon the fabric of the world as an artifice that is given because she felt turned away from the world. And this was oppressive. And so she desired to be in the world in the sense of having the world recognize her and acknowledge her, which gives one a certain sense of freedom to see and appear as one is for who one is. But Rahel can't find that. And I think that's part of the great irony here. And she could never find that through another person.
I want to jump in because I want to agree with Margaret. What comes through for me is that she had this hope that she would escape her Jewish identity by getting married, but as soon as she got in the relationship, she couldn't deny her own self. She couldn't accept this person who didn't exist. And as I think it's hard to measure how much of this is just gender. I mean, women in general had no place in the world. Yeah. And so, yes, being Jewish adds to that. But this is, 18th century, this is how women got any kind of status and recognition. So in some sense, she was in the same place as all women, except she had nobody there striking the bargain for her. She had no family behind her to negotiate that, which at that point many women still did. So she was on her own having to do that.
Yeah. No.
I'd like to say a word here. And of course, this is a very different life that Arendt led, but I think it's what keeps ringing in my mind is Arendt, when Locher, her husband, died, or even before he died, she would say to him all the time, "You're my four walls. You're my four walls." And you were saying, for Rahel, the world didn't hold her. And I agree with what people are saying. For a lot of women, they need the world to hold them somehow. There have to be some structures to hold these people. There's no place. And but for Arendt also, she saw her husband Blocher as, even before he was her husband, I think, that he was holding her, and Rahel did not have that. And maybe that's what you were looking for.
But he was the four walls that's also the phrase that Arendt uses to describe the private realm, right? So, and it's what Rahel desires is not to feel, she doesn't actually care about being loved, is my sense. That's not what she's after. She doesn't, she's not really, it's not about being struck by what is it Hermes? I don't know, whatever, Valentine's Day is coming, right? Whatever, she doesn't care about that and getting married, like falling in love and getting married. She cares about a relationship as a status symbol that might propel her into proper aristocratic society where she could be accepted by those that she thought were valuable, while casting off her own Jewish identity. Arendt, on the other hand, highly prized the private realm, and her intimate friendships and relationships, and she thought that that was an essential space for being able to appear in the world. But Rahel never felt like she could appear in the world, and she saw marriage as an instrument that would enable her to appear in the world, and so that she could have a sense of the world, I think. So I would draw a distinction there, but I think that's right about Arendt in a certain way, but I think it's in some ways counterposed to the way Arendt is understanding Rahel, is somebody who is entirely indifferent to who it is she actually gets married to, as long as that person is of good social standing. Margaret, were you trying to jump back in, or Susan?
No,
Yeah,
this is Suzanne. Oh,
if you look at the
sorry.
paragraph right above what you had read on 43, goes to this, what seems to be, displeasure or almost anger that Rahel has with him, because the very fact that he's born into a certain social status without having to appropriate it, without having to any kind of conscious awareness of it, just is, and she kind of, eats on that basically, and she, it says she draws him out of his own situation and so that she would be able to love him.
Yeah.
Only when he was no one in particular could she successfully silence the question in herself. I think there's a funny parallel with an earlier part of the chapter where she's about the idea of, what can a Jew do? You can only assimilate by breaking from the group. You can only do this as an individual exercise. And, now she's turning that same critique on a nobleman, who would seem to have the trappings. She can't forget and not looking at himself.
Yeah. Susan, did you want to? Your mic's off, Susan. There you go.
It's Suzanne. I'm back. I'm sorry. I'm doing this on the phone, which is not a very good way to do it. But I found this reading really fascinating in terms of what it reveals about this particular person who's a Jewess, and how, I took very seriously what Hannah Arendt says early on, and I guess it was the reading for the last time, about what her task is.
Yeah.
And she describes the very distinctive kind of biography that she's doing.
Yeah.
And I guess I worry when we kind of slip from one life to another, and I worry that we may not take seriously enough the sort of conceptual task she's about, and maybe even methodological task. I think she is taking on something special here. She's clearly not doing a typical psychobiography in any way.
Yeah, absolutely.
She really is trying to reveal a world the way it looked for this particular other woman. And I see in that the development of a whole new kind of theory of personhood. I don't think she ever pushed it as far as she might have, but there's a really interesting new kind of psychology at work here. So I just wanted to kind of put that on the table. So,
yeah, I think one of the things that we start to get in this chapter in that vein that will come out, that will unfold as we move through the book, is the significant role that salons played for Jewish society at this time, and created a realm of appearance when the world did not provide that realm of appearance. And I think, it's an interesting argument that Arendt starts to develop as a counter public sphere to the proper public sphere. That doesn't, to my knowledge, she doesn't really flesh out in her later writing, but
Right.
appears here as this really important space of appearances, which is not the proper political sphere, the way that she would think about it, but offers that sense of recognition, which is essential to her definition of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
And I think that raises an interesting question about what kind of recognized, what kind of counter spheres of recognition exist and have existed in history and over time, and what role they play in appearances and how we feel ourselves to be human and to be human in relationship to the world around us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So Joanna writes in the chat box, was not Arendt also, as Julia Kristeva says, a fervent admirer of the narrated life? Yes, that this practice of writing life histories, this goes along with what Suzanne was saying, writing life histories brings meaning to a person's life. It brings meaning about the protagonist's life. I think it answers the question, who are you? Is this possibly another reason she's interested in Varnhagen? Do you want to add to that, Joanna? If you're still on. I mean, I think absolutely, Arendt is interested in narrative and storytelling, and she doesn't write another biography, but she certainly writes a number of biographical pieces throughout her career. Men in Dark Times is composed of these kinds of philosophically inflected biographical essays about people that were important interlocutors for her in her own thinking. And her beautiful piece on Auden that we ended Thinking Without a Banister with, she approaches thinkers as individuals. And she doesn't do the kind of usual political theory move of strictly separating the private life of the individual from the political or philosophical ideas. She, in her essay on Rosa Luxemburg, which I just reread on the 100th anniversary of the murder of Luxemburg and Liebknecht, she starts by talking about how, there's this kind of tragic irony in Rosa's life as well, where her work never received the recognition that it deserved in her lifetime. And she talks about Benjamin and her essay on Walter Benjamin in a kind of similar way. I think she's interested, in a certain sense, in providing recognition for people who she sees as not having received appropriate recognition. Now that a number of her essays have this kind of argument folded into them. She writes about people that she cares about and who she feels like deserve to be remembered in writing. Joanna, were you trying to?
Yes, I would like to also suggest that she's also trying to figure out or to understand how memory is constituted, because memory can be constituted in so many various ways, and I think that biographical narrative is one way that she can sort of or evoked memory, a good way to preserve someone that she thinks deserves that.
Can I think it would be helpful to go back a little bit, to the preface, but before I do, I just want to point out in the fairly close to the beginning of this chapter, it's page 26 to 27 in my version, probably a little later in the other version, the paragraph beginning, "From this freedom," was derived for a striking manner of describing things, people, and situations. That she was free from all tradition, she was new, she was original, she was empty. And Arendt has this, to me, striking sentence given the future of Arendt's work.
That's
in
34.
34, in her originality, in her mania for thinking, Rahel evinced not only the open-mindedness, but also the emptiness of the person who is utterly dependent upon experiences, who needs a whole life to form every opinion. She was too young to have experiences, too isolated to know where life could strike her. There's a lot here, and for someone who later becomes identified with thinking as the core of what it means to be human, she's also, even in her late work, critical of thinking, especially Martin Heidegger's thinking. which she sees as worldless.
Yeah.
And she thinks Heidegger's thinking, which is connected to the experience of the Ereignis, the encounter with being, das Sein, as a worldless thinking that does not reconcile with the world. There's a way in which this line from Rahel and her introspection to Rousseau to the philosopher's error of world withdrawal is there in her work. And to go back to the preface, of the book, where she, and I forget who was saying this before, but where she says, here's what I'm doing. My aim, she says, was never to write a book about Rahel, about her personality, right? Not to interpret her. What interested me solely was to narrate the story of Rahel's life as she herself might have told it, which, whatever that means, it's a fascinating endeavor. She considered herself extraordinary, but her view of the source of that extraordinariness, I'm paraphrasing here, differed from that of others. She attempted to explain this feeling in innumerable phrases and images. Her whole effort was to expose herself to life so that it could strike her like a storm without an umbrella. What am I doing? Nothing. I am letting life rain upon me. And so a lot of what we're struggling with in this chapter about how she sort of lets herself be drawn into this love with Frankenstein, and she embraces his refusal to love her and her worship of him and her love of him as her suffering. I'm letting life rain upon me. It's her experience. It's her feelings. And she doesn't judge them. She has them. And she accepts it. And she's a fatalist about accepting it. And Arendt is really trying to narrate the story of Rahel's fatalistic, letting experiences happen, an introspection that has no specificity and no world, a worldless letting the world happen to me, which I think Arendt sees as such a purely modern experience that's going to have enormous implications on loneliness and on the modern experience and modern existence. And she sees in Rahel, and this goes back to the first question by Daphne, in a sense, almost a quintessential modern, inner worldly, thus world withdrawing, world escaping person who wants to be in a world but doesn't yet know how to. And there's really something extraordinary about this act of Rahel's that Arendt is trying to narrate and let come forward.
Yeah, I think it's also, I mean, it feeds into what will later become the way Arendt thinks about loneliness, but it's also part of Rahel's identity, as I read these 2 pages, that this part, she wasn't particularly smart, okay, but she had great wit, and her wit was in a certain sense a kind of Socratic wit, in that she didn't know anything, and that she wasn't, she wasn't of the world, and, Arendt's going to later, all thinking has to move from experience, so on. But I mean, this quality of Rahel's, I think in a certain sense is confounding, because on the one hand, it does have a certain virtue for originality and uniqueness, but on the other hand, it's part of what makes her susceptible to desiring assimilation, casting off any of those ties which bind us to the world. What is it that allows us to have a relationship to the world? Family, tradition, culture, all of these social artifices that Rahel is without. she, I mean, it was it's not her originality in the passage you read. It's not, it's, I think it's both a great virtue and a great vice in the way that Arendt's reading it. And it's not very generous.
I'd like to understand a little bit about what we mean when we use the word worldless and worldly. I mean, part of it, I guess, is, okay, if you're worldly, then you have certain frames of reference that are connected to, I guess, the reigning paradigms that the society, by which the society understands itself. Are we saying worldless means that I have withdrawn from that and I'm in my own world, I'm in my own solipsistic experience, not connected with the world out there and the paradigms that it uses? I'd like just to understand how we're using it a little bit.
So I think worldliness for Arendt is a kind of proper concept. The world, which Arendt, I mean, so she talks in The Human Condition about Earth and the world. And she says that, you know, men were born upon the earth and they share it together. And the earth is this, you know, place that we inhabit together. And it's one of the reasons she starts with the exploration of space and how that might decenter our understanding of what it means to be earthbound creatures. But world for Arendt is that which we artifice together. The world is that which we make with one another in common. So if you think about her definition of action in The Human Condition, she talks, you know, about action in concert with other people, or when she's talking about the distinction between labor and work. Labor is fundamentally private in a certain sense because it's consumptive and it doesn't produce anything lasting that can remain in the world. Whereas work, architecture, art, poetry, language, creates, fabricates, makes things which last and can outlast us in the world. So to be in the world, for Arendt, in the way that she's in worldliness, and the way that she's talking about Rahel in this book and in these 2 pages we've been looking at for the past couple of minutes, she's, I think, primarily talking about social relationships and language. She says on the bottom of page 34, I think she says, having neither models nor tradition, right? She wasn't attached to anything that anyone before her had left, right? She consequently had no real consciousness of what words belonged together and what did not, right? But she was original. That's a nice way of saying she has no sense of language, right? She's, and then on the top of the next page, when she's talking about Goethe, and certainly, moreover, she was too curious, for she had begun too early to settle with herself and the world without relying upon anyone. There remained for her, therefore, only social assimilation through marriage, a course frequently adopted in those days. So she doesn't have any of the ties that bind her to the world, to appearance. I think more importantly, in this sense, to appearance in the world, and the social ties that she's desiring. And she doesn't have a sense of culture, right? One of the great examples of worldliness for Arendt is artistic production, poetry. Would be someone precisely like Goethe, who Rahel turns away from because she wants to exist. She doesn't want to be taken in. She wants to be her own person. She rejects the relationships that are essential for worldliness. I think there's, you know, and I think this is part of what Roger was driving at before, maybe not, but it made me think of it. it's very much related to loneliness in a certain sense. And it's hard in reading this chapter not to see Rahel, at least in Arendt's parsing for what it is, um, as a kind of lonely person on her own. To exist in the world without any sense of belonging, to not have family, to not have tradition, to appear out of nowhere, to come from nothing, and to know at the end of the day that it is you and no one else. I think that that's an experience many of us have been very fortunate not to have had. Perhaps some of us have had it. But for, Rahel, by virtue of the fact of her Jewishness and being a woman and existing at this place and time and coming from where she did not feel like the world was holding her. She felt alone in the world. And that loneliness inhibited her ability to be worldly, to find meaning, to form connections with other people based upon them as people, as individuals, as unique beings. Everything for her appeared as an opportunity to escape her identity, and that stopped her in a way from being able to form meaningful relationships with other people, specifically the Count in this chapter. But I think you see how loneliness in that sense, loneliness and love, two things for Arendt, which fundamentally turn us away from the world. And we see them conspire together here. It's not a very, we can't end the conversation there. That is not a happy note.
Sam?
Hi, Susan.
No, it's Daphna.
Oh, hi, Daphna. The faces that pop up don't always sync up with the voices.
Mine is the geriatric face with the glasses.
No, stop it. I love your glasses.
In some of her writings, she uses the word worldlessness to define the Jews' understanding of their own history. And she says that one of the problems that the Jews had is that when they try to understand their own history, it is worldless. I don't know if you remember that, but that made me think of the problem that this particular concept of worldlessness is very rich for Hannah Arendt. It's a really pivotal concept.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Do you remember where that exact, that phrasing sounds familiar from some of the writing in the 40s to me, but I would have to go through and look. I think this goes back to, part of what we were talking about earlier in the conversation. And what Arendt is really doing, and, Rahel in many ways is an example of a much larger argument that Arendt is making about the Jewish people and the loss of Jewish identity at this moment in time. And thinking about what it means to be worldless in relationship to recognition, to not receive recognition in public or recognition socially, and how that affects people's understanding of themselves as private and social beings. So
I'd like to respond to the question about the Jews being worldless.
Who's talking? Bob?
Yeah.
Hi.
And hi. And I studied in a yeshiva for about a year and a half. And one of the things I was really struck by is in this kind of Orthodox place, they had no sense of history at all. Everything that happened in Jewish history all happened today. It was like you're reading it and it's like it's happening now. Well, and I could never get a sense of, where in the process of these 3,000 years are we talking? That didn't matter because they didn't really think in terms of history in the way Western people think of history, that has a linear quality. It's not linear. And so in that sense, In that sense, it actually is worldless in the sense that in the way Western people think of the world. It has
Yeah.
nothing to do.
I have the quote if you'd like me to read it to you.
Sure.
It's from her essay, The Enlightenment and the Jewish Question in the Jewish Writings.
Mm-hmm.
She says that the Jews have become a people without a history within history. They stand face to face with nothing. For within a historical reality, from within a European secular world, they are forced somehow to adopt themselves to this world, to form themselves. But for them, formation is by necessity everything that is the non-Jewish world. And she says in that same article that they had no grasp of the larger historical context in which they lived. They were worldless.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good quote. I think that echoes really nicely with what Robert just said. In the sense of being worldless and the way that we understand the world coming into being through fabrication over time, through history, and what is recognized is missing.
I want to go back to this idea that Rahel just let the life happen to her. She says that about herself, but I'm not sure that's at all what I'm seeing. I mean, she was looking for Finkenstein. She was out to accomplish this assimilation. I don't know that she's actually letting life happen to her. She seems to be somewhat clear on what she's trying to accomplish. And it also reminds me of African Americans passing and how they had to completely, totally deny everything about their previous lives in order to do that. And I think there's some similarities, although she's not totally hiding it. But the attempt and the way she's trying to live seems similar to that situation as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, it strikes me as well that she's exercising quite a bit of control over her personal life, at least much more so than Arendt is willing to, I mean, give her credit for, unless, I mean, and maybe this goes to the passage Daphne just said and Robert's comments. You know, she's thinking about Rahel in a kind of, I want to use the Hegelian phrase, but I don't mean it in the Hegelian sense of a kind of world historical narrative, right? She's thinking about what possibilities are available to Rahel at the time that she's living and what it is her life represents about this historical moment and the worldlessness of the Jewish people at this point in time, and how that sense of worldlessness is going to make ground for, I don't think you can say that, lay the groundwork for what happens in Germany when she's finishing writing this book. I think Rahel becomes a kind of case study for her. You know, more so than thinking of this as a biographical text. It's, Rahel is a kind of portrait of a Jewish woman at this point in time who represents what's happening at this historical moment, in that sense. And so on the one hand, yes, I think Rahel is exercising a great deal of influence over her own life and it strikes me that she's quite proactive, but on the other hand, the ways in which she can act are delimited by the historical circumstances of the time that she's living in.
Maybe one thing we could say is if it's accurate that in many ways, or many of the Jews were worldless, that may have interfered with their ability to interpret what was going on in 1933 in Germany and really get a sense of what do we need to do, how can we act in the world to avoid an enormous catastrophe. Maybe they couldn't really interpret it because they just weren't thinking like what actually can happen in this real world situation we're in.
That was kind of her point too.
I think she says that in Origins.
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways there is a lot of origins in this book. I think she's workshopping a lot of the key conceptual arguments that we see come to fruition in Origins. You know, and I think that is, you know, part of the irony, which is being told here through a love affair, which is entertaining, but it's, you know, the desire for assimilation, of shedding one's roots and letting go of who one is and where one, you know, is worldly, and finds meaning through, you know, what one reaches for outside of that in bourgeois society ended up in part leading to the rise of the Third Reich. You know, it's, you know, I think Arendt sees the tragedy in that, as she's telling it here in Rahel.
Sam, I have a question about on pages 27 and 28.
Are you in the, can you see, or are you just on the phone?
In that version.
Okay.
And where she goes into a long description of the ways in which Mendelssohn both did and did not assimilate. And I thought, well, if she's laying this out as the groundwork, is this, I mean, is she saying that there's something not quite authentic about the way in which Mendelssohn played it? Or is she saying that that is appropriate option? I don't mean to make it sound so blunt, but it did strike me that she goes through a pretty detailed description of what Mendelssohn himself, you know, he was content with the enlightened absolutism of Frederick II, under which, quote, the Jews enjoy the most honorable liberty in the exercise of their religion. And goes on to say he was satisfied to be that, quote, least in the habit. And seems like in the rest of the chapter, she's playing with how does that really.
You're cutting out. I heard, how is that really? But I think this goes to a kind of something Roger mentioned in passing earlier, which is really important, is that, you know, in many ways, what Rahel represents at this point in time, as we were just talking about, is an individual, is a modern individual. And Arendt is thinking about the consequences of the Enlightenment, and how the Enlightenment radically reshaped the way individuals thought about themselves in relationship to the world around them, and thought about themselves as individual I beings. And so I think Arendt is quite critical of that here, on 28, 29, when she's talking about, in other words, there could be no thought of ending the Jewish question. The Enlightenment manner had become contemptible. Schleiermacher averred Friedlander wished to perpetuate the Mendelssohnian Enlightenment because it had enabled him to forget his own origins. Right? So she's directly connecting the Enlightenment thinking in the sense in society at this time to the ability to a mindset that enables one to cast off their identity, as a key part of modernity, and that turns identity into something which is not. We talked about this a little bit in our first session, and she talks about this in the first chapter. You know, identity is something which is not fixed, but is something that is malleable, and that is, you know. And then she goes on to talk about how the Jewish people did not understand this new era in society on the next page. That I think Mendelssohn represents that for Arendt. I think that's, you know, she's using the Mendelssohn here to set up both that kind of implicit critique of the Enlightenment mentality and to tell the story about Mendelssohn's daughter, who turned away from the world altogether. So I think we're at time. We thank you for a lovely conversation. I think we really pulled a lot out of a chapter that is, it was quite fun to read, but I think there's a lot packed in there. We will pick up with the next chapter. I think not. And I look forward to seeing everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. See you next week or 2 weeks.
2 weeks.